Okay. Well, firstly, my apologies for speaking in English. I'm sitting in my cottage in Norfolk, Merogalma, but I'm a long way from Nepal, but I feel there in spirit. But the first apology is for language. But it's not just Nepali I'm not speaking today. I'm not speaking in Maithili or Bhojpuri or Urdu or Hindi. So my apologies to all Madheshis for my lack of language. I have had some experience in the area, in what we could call Madhesh, and I will be challenging the notion of Madhesh as a political concept in this talk. I've always tried to be honest and outrageous, and no doubt this will stir many feathers and upset many people, but the intention is to be constructive. And my concern is about the difference between diversity and division. And diversity can be embraced as something very positive, a culture, a society, a place, a country with many different cultures, languages, opinions, and so on. And that can be made a positive thing. But division is often difficult and sometimes leads to conflict and violence. And that, although not always a bad thing, poses a number of serious problems. So those are the apologies. I have, as was said in the introduction, briefly had some research experience. I spent during the 1970s quite a lot of time in Kapilvastu, in Rupandey and Nawarparasi, in what we call the West Central Nepal Tarai at the time. I have worked with Tura and Nemaf in producing work on the Muslim communities of Nepal, most of whom, of course, are in the Tarai or in the Madhesh, although they don't see themselves necessarily as Madheshis. And I think I've probably visited or driven through every district in the region. Now, for thousands of years, the Madhesh, the middle country, the middle territory, has been between other states. It's been a boundary area, an area of fluid boundaries. We have only to go back all the way to the Ramayana to learn of the importance of states and peripheries. And this has been an area, I think, of considerable interest for many, many researchers, historians, and anthropologists, but has surprisingly received much less attention than it deserves, and much less attention than the hill areas, particularly among foreigners and foreign anthropologists in particular. Now, I was introduced to the region, as I say, in the 1970s, and spent a lot of time literally walking through villages. There was the beginnings of an east-west highway at the time, but no main road between Butol and Narayangat. And so we came to be fairly intimate with the region during that time. But the further east, the area that is now Province 2, has a deep and long history, of course. So the Madhesh is a difficult region to define. I'll come on to that in a moment. But it is particularly the plains areas between the hills and mountains of Nepal to the north. And of course, Madhesh is now part of Nepal, and the states of India to the south, of Bharat to the south, for thousands of years. I think I would start with the definition that was agreed, perhaps reluctantly, by the Gorkhali state in 1816, the Treaty of Sugauli, which drew the boundary and the border between the expansionist Gorkhali state and the expansionist British East India Company. So if we start in 1816, that's when, in a way, the country that is now Nepal is defined, and the area of Madhesh is defined as Nepali. Interestingly, it was not until 200 years later, in 2015, that a constitution was finally agreed after much debate, which divided the Tarai, the Madhesh, into a number of provinces, which also contained hill areas. The 2015 constitution, of course, started a great debate about precisely how the provinces of the new Federal Democratic Republic would be defined. And in a sense, it seems to me that the outcome that we have now, and I'm coming up to the present now, to 2021, is a situation where the struggle for the political identity of Madhesh is now very deeply compromised and may increasingly in the future, I suggest, become irrelevant. A big statement, and I'm sure there will be many who will debate this. But the reason I say this is because for many years between the 2006-7 comprehensive peace agreement, there was tremendous debate, and particularly political movements in Madhesh, in the Terai, about the exclusion of Madheshis from power, which was centered in Kathmandu. And of course, those of you who were there then will remember the movements, the political popular movements of Madheshis in the period 2007-2008. And at that time, there were voices which spoke of a unified Madhesh extending from the far west to the far east. There were those like Dr. C.K. Raut, who argued that Madhesh should secede, should even become independent, something that was, I guess, difficult even then to fully understand the implications of, but was representative of the idea that the Madhesh was something distinctive and could be autonomous. But it's my belief that that argument for an independent or certainly recognizable Madhesh has been lost. We now have 7 provinces, is that right? I think that's right. Most of which, in fact, all of which, apart from province 2, which is distinctive, and we can talk about that later, now comprise areas of mountains, hills, and plains, and the peoples that are in them. And it seems to me that that final provincial definition, which was a subject of so much debate and controversy between 2006 and the present time, has effectively demolished the idea of Madhesh as a single coherent political entity. Nevertheless, it is a region that is distinctive in many ways as being historically and at the present time politically marginal to the extraordinary antics of the leaders of the 4 main political parties in Kathmandu. And this is a tragic situation for Nepal as well as for Madheshis. The representation in politics is very much through parties that are centralized, nationalist, in the worst possible way, in my view, populist, and which do not represent adequately the interests of the whole population of the Terai or of Madhesh, if you can still call it that. So it's a peripheral region in important political respects, but it's now one that is divided into several distinct provinces. The Eastern Province, number 1, contains the probably more developed parts of the region in terms of industrial and agricultural development, but also has one of the most mixed populations of hill and plains people across the Terai, across the Madhesh. Province 2 is distinctive, and its future, I think, will be extremely interesting. It's the only one that is essentially in the plains, a number of 8 districts which have a very substantial degree of cultural homogeneity. I talked about the Ramayana and going back thousands of years. That culture, the Maithili culture, the language Maithili, is a fundamental element of the deep history of that province, of that region, and of those people who live there. And it's a distinctive province in many other respects as well. And perhaps we can all talk a bit more about that in the future. but it is the only one that is effectively only in the plains now. The others, obviously, 3 is largely in the hills. 3 is the province that is the center, if you like, but has managed to creep down into the Terai, into the plains, and has a border with India. 4, 5, 6, 7 are all peripheral in other ways, but many of them, most of their area, if you like, is in the hills and in the mountains. So this is the situation as we face it in 2021, that the notion of Madhesh, which is contested in many different ways, is now a fragmented entity and is divided into new political entities, the provinces and the states. In the past, the notion of Madhesh has varied. I mean, there are different interpretations, obviously, as to who constitute Madheshis. If I look back briefly, I'll just refer to my notes. The Citizen Act of 1952, just after the overthrow of the Ranas, defined Madheshis as essentially people of Indian origin, people who had been immigrants, who had come in from India, Hindus and Muslims. And the definition of Nepali citizenship was one which required them to spend at least 5 years within Nepal before they could become Nepali citizens. So at the beginning of the, what you might call, modern period of Nepal, Indian origin was part of the definition of the Madheshis. And it's true to say, as many Madheshis have recognized over the years, that they were looked down upon and they were, in many ways, disinherited. And although the Citizenship Act allowed for naturalization after 5 years, there are many people still living whose parents, if you like, never gained full citizenship, and people who still do not have written accepted citizenship. In the Citizens Act of 1963, there was a slight a difference. You had to read and write Nepali. So language in the 60s became absolutely crucial. And I can remember when I first started reading about the Terai, about the people of Madhesh, it was about language and the struggle between Hindi and Nepali. And under Mahendra, the development project to create a Nepal involved a language and culture which meant that people had to be able to read and write Nepali. Now, that's a very demanding criterion for citizenship. The Citizenship Act of 2006, and then most recently the Constitution of 2015, all allow naturalization. That is, you can transform yourself in a sort of idiom, if you like, from a caterpillar to a butterfly by naturalization, by becoming Nepali, by transforming yourself. And I think that's long history, if you like, of definitions, constitutional definitions, citizenship acts, which define Madheshis as different as having to become Nepali, rather than being Nepalis by right, is part of a cultural and political heritage that has meant that Madhesh has always been regarded by those at the center, not always those in the hills, I think, but those at the center, as a sort of marginal area with marginal people who look different and are basically of Indian origin. And this is a very difficult situation with which to struggle. And it gave rise, as I say, to a strong feeling throughout the period, I suppose, starting with the 90s in particular, but into the 2000s, the idea of a Madhesh as a political entity challenging this dominant, centralized, hill-based, Kathmandu-based notion of who could and couldn't be a Nepali. So that is a checkered history. And I think that there are serious problems, as I say today, about the notion of Madhesh as a political concept and as the basis for political movements. And now I come on to some of the divisions, if you like, or differences or diversity that characterize this region. Firstly, geographically, it's a very long way from the far west to the far east. And it's not surprising that one of the early nation building enterprises in the 60s and the 70s was to try and build an east-west highway, a unifying feature which would allow a reduction in travel time from the far west to the far east. And that east-west highway has had a huge impact, there's no doubt at all, not just in transforming who lives near the road and far from the road, but in making it possible to travel from one end of a long corridor to another. But the fact remains that if you're in Kailali or Kanchanpur, you're a long way from Japa or Biratnagar or what have you. It's a very long distance. I suppose Nepalganj is the most central place, if you like, from west and east. Sorry, not Nepalganj, Narayangat is the most central place. But geographically, it's in a very difficult position. And just by comparing it with other territories which are still struggling to achieve some sort of recognition, like Palestine, for example, geography and territoriality does play a part in making it easier or more difficult to achieve a sort of political unity, a cultural unity, a sense of identity. So it's a long, thin strip. And which is the most central part is debatable, as I say. But even in each province, there was considerable debate about which would be the capital, which would be the center. Now, that is in a process of evolution as we speak, obviously. And now I think it's true to say that the capitals of the provinces are now more or less fixed. And again, Province 2 is the one that is the most coherent, geographically defined, centralized in the sense that a capital which is recognized has been identified. But the others are scattered, if you like. So geography is divisive, I would say, is difficult. You can't be made into a political entity simply by the fact that you are in the plains and on limited height above sea level. But there are other divisions as well, which are obviously those that are divisions within Nepal as a whole. And these are all, I think, problematic in many ways. As someone who comes from within a Marxist tradition, my first interest is in class. What are the classes and what are the class divisions within the Tarai, within the Madhesh region? Now, what's interesting to me is that it's very rare to find studies which actually identify and define the social classes that exist. And we know there are small farmers, but some of these are still peasants, essentially subsistence producers, while others have become petty commodity producers. That is to say, part of their idea of their farm economy is to produce commodities for the market. Still relatively few are capitalist farmers employing wage labor on a regular basis in order to accumulate and build profits. And there is still a surprisingly large number of landowners who employ labor on an occasional basis, have labor that is tied to the farm, that I don't like the term semi-feudal, but are large landowners whose interests are not on producing and accumulating. And there is surprisingly a large number still of those. They've managed to keep their lands together by hook or by crook. But one of the major changes in the region has been the massive shift to the towns, the growth of urban areas, the emergence of the service sector, of merchants and traders, of rentiers, people who gain their income, if you like, by renting out land that is now of higher value because it's in the town. The level of industrial development remains very low. It's really only in the Eastern Tarai that there's any significant industrial development. And so there is a limited working class in the classic sense. But in Nepal, to my regret, it's often impossible to identify social classes without specific investigations. All too often, there is an association between caste and class. And the census and most studies have come to privilege caste and ethnicity, the social characteristics, above the economic. And so it's very difficult to clarify the class structure without it being constantly overlain by and associated with caste. But nevertheless, we can say something about the divisions there that I think are quite significant. I was looking at figures comparing the National Social Indicators Index for 2012 with the same for 2018, just as a guide to recent developments. And I'm struck by the fact that the wealthy have got relatively wealthier and the poor have got relatively poorer. And that there is a very clear distinction between the upper castes, or groups, shall we call them anyway, because it includes Newar, and some will debate whether Newar constitutes a caste or a people or an ethnic group or what have you. But if you look at the figures, and forgive me, I'll just look away and look at those. In 2018, the annual average household consumption per capita, I'll just take this as a one index, if you like, of inequality, was something like 64,000 rupees, 64,000 for all Nepal. So you're either above or below that, 64,000. Hill Brahmins, the household consumption per capita was over 100,000. So 64, 100,000. Newars, 95,000. And then Hill Chautaris, 69,000. So all of those well over and in the hills for the most part. Then Madheshi or Tarai Banchetaris, is they seem to be mingled there in the data, 68,000. So if you're Banchetari in the Madhesh, in the Tarai, you are better off in terms of household consumption per capita than almost anyone else in the Tarai. But you are less well off, if you like, than Hill Brahmins and Chetaris or Newars. So there's some profound inequalities there. But what strikes me as significant is that, if you like, the fifth category, which is Janajati in the hills, is 60,000, just below the national average. In the hills, the only group that is significantly less well off in this particular criterion than the rest are Hill Dalits. But majority of the rest of the Madheshis or Tarai people are well below the national average, so that other castes, 48,000 per capita, compared with 64. Tarai Janajati, 48,600. Muslims, 48,000. And lowest of all in the whole country, Madheshi Dalits at 36,000. Not much more than half the national average. So there are gross inequalities in terms of wealth, in terms of income, in terms of land ownership, and class and caste are not the same thing, but sometimes the figures give a sort of proxy, if you like. But what's striking to me is that on all these counts, the vast majority of people in the Tarai and Madhesh, on average, are well below the national average. And in Nepal as a whole, it is Dalits who are the least well off. So these are important distinctions and divisions, which one would have thought would play a part in the politics of Nepal, the politics of Madhesh. But I don't see that, except I do see that the majority of the leadership of all the political parties come from particular social economic backgrounds. Now, I won't tar them all with the same brush and say they're all Ban Chetri. It's not that simple at all. But there is a very serious class difference between the leadership of political parties and the vast majority of those who support them, or at least vote for them. So those are important divisions. There are also other divisions which have been important in the definition of what is Madheshi. At one point, the Maoists thought that they would be able to constitute a number of ethnic-based provinces, and Taruan, the place for the Taru, was one of those. Now, the Taru is a complicated notion and political concept, social concept. These are people who have come to have a certain sort of identity, but they are scattered geographically, they're divided linguistically, and although the vast majority are in certain areas of the Tarai, they are essentially a people divided and fragmented. But they, insofar as they constituted a political entity, objected strongly to the idea of being labeled as Madheshis. They saw themselves as something different, as Taru, with their own culture, their own languages, their own history. And equally, a particular religious group, that's not defined by ethnicity, but by religion, the Muslims, also objected very strongly to the idea of being Madheshis. They were defined by a different culture and identity, one of religion. So there are deep divisions within the region, which I think make it very difficult to identify the basis for politics of a unified kind. Now, there were and still are Madheshi-based parties, certainly in 2006, 2007, and the important lobbying against the exclusion of Madheshi politicians and political representation from the power center in Kathmandu. There were political parties that claimed to represent Madheshis, as a group. That's moved away. That's not disappeared, but has declined enormously. And the four major parties claim to be national rather than regional, although Madheshis may well argue they're still dominated by hill people or by Banchetris from privileged backgrounds. But the unified political voice of Madheshis has effectively, it seems to me, disappeared. If you look at the more recent elections, it's the, I hesitate to call them whatever they are now, but what used to be the Unified Nepal Communist Party, which has now redefined itself again as Maoist Centre and UML. When they amalgamated, they were extraordinarily powerful in terms of electoral support. And the Nepali Congress Party continues to be an important part of the politics of the Terai, of the Madheshi region. But it's really four parties that dominate national politics now, and none of them effectively represent, it seems to me, the interests of Madheshis. So I come to the end of my talk by asking what is the political and economic and social and cultural future for people of the Madhesh? And I have to say, I do not see it as a unified future. I think that it will differ from region to region, that's province to province. It will differ from linguistic group to linguistic group. It will differ from religious group to religious group. And certainly the future of Muslims in Nepal is one that is a problematic one, I have to say. And differences sometimes become the basis for conflict. And there have been conflicts, not just between people of different social class and ethnicity, but between people of different religion, Hindus and Muslims, rarely Buddhists, I have to say, as far as I know, in Nepal. But these are divisions which I think will continue to mean that there will be different trajectories for different groups of people by social class, by caste, by ethnicity, by region or province, by religion. I think that the only possibility would be to rethink politics, to develop a base which does truly represent all those diverse and different interests in the Madhesh, particularly of those who are poor and disadvantaged, who constitute the vast majority. And that would have to be a national party, in my view, not a regional party or a party based in certain provinces. Although Province 2, obviously electorally in terms of support for parties, is very different from the other areas and has much less support for the four main parties, because it is a distinctive region, province, culture, linguistic language group. But on the whole, I think that the future would have to lie in a new national party. I would like to see the space occupied by a progressive party. I think the label of Maoist or communist is absurd these days for the parties that exist. They are national, authoritarian, populist parties, but bear no resemblance, it seems to me, to anything that I can recognize as communist or Maoist or what have you. It would have to be a progressive party committed to fundamental change, to privilege and help the disadvantaged, particularly Dalits, who are by and large those with least resources, least land, poorest and lowest incomes, and lowest consumption levels. It would have to be a party which committed itself to gender equality, and that is a major problem in the Madhesh, particularly in the central and eastern Terai, where the position of women is still by no means what it should be. And it should be a popular national people's party. And at that point, I will stop.